The greatest biography ever written about John D. Rockefeller is Ron Chernow's Titan, a nearly 800-page deep dive into the life of a man who began with almost nothing and ended up shaping the American economy, more than any individual before or after him. But the more you revisit that book and the earlier-to-volume work by Allan Nevins, plus Rockefeller's own letters and memoirs from family members, the more you realize something people regularly miss. Rockefeller didn't rise because he controlled oil. He rose because he controlled himself long before he controlled anything else. Before we go deeper, make sure you subscribe, because every week we break down the minds of history's greatest builders and extract the principles you and I can actually use today. What I want to focus on in this episode is not Standard Oil, not the antitrust battles, not the wealth. I want to focus on the internal machinery that allowed Rockefeller to turn pennies into power, because his story isn't a story of luck. It's not even a story of genius. It's a story of extraordinary emotional discipline, mathematical precision, and a worldview shaped by instability that forced him to build a dynasty brick by brick, cent by cent, ledger line by ledger line. To understand Rockefeller's mind, you have to go back to his childhood, where the seeds of his empire were planted. He grew up in a home torn between two worlds. On one side was his father, William Avery Rockefeller, the wandering salesman who charmed towns, disappeared for months, broke promises, and lived by improvisation. On the other side was his mother, Eliza, a devout Baptist woman who worshipped order, with the intensity of someone who knew that chaos was always waiting outside the door. These two forces collided in young John's mind, the unpredictability of his father and the controlled steadiness of his mother. And instead of being consumed by that contradiction, he made a choice that defined his life. He chose order. Chernow describes it clearly. Rockefeller wasn't simply frugal as a child. He was methodical. While other boys spent money as soon as they earned it, John saved everything. Not out of fear, but out of curiosity. He wanted to understand money. He wanted to measure it, track it, study it, control it. And when he earned his first real wages at 16, he didn't celebrate, he didn't brag. He walked to his mother's table, opened a blank ledger, and wrote down every cent with the precision of a bookkeeper twice his age. This wasn't bookkeeping. This was identity formation. It was the birth of a mind that believed the world could be stabilized with numbers, discipline, and structure. That mindset hardened during his early jobs, where he worked as a clerk, surrounded by invoices, shipping records, and balance sheets. He wasn't just learning math. He was learning how the world moved, how goods flowed, how profit emerged, how inefficiency destroyed businesses, and how a calm mind could see opportunities that anxious competitors missed. Long before he refined oil, he refined his habits. Before he built Standard Oil, he built a mental fortress. And before he made a single strategic strike in business, he made thousands of small disciplined decisions in private. By the time he earned his first real profits, the pattern was set. Discipline wasn't something he used. Discipline was what he was, and that is how pennies began turning into power. If you want to understand how Rockefeller eventually built Standard Oil into the most powerful industrial machine in the world, you have to understand something most biographies mention but rarely dwell on. He never chased money. He chased stability. That's what separates him from other tycoons of the era: Carnegie, Gould, Vanderbilt, men who raced, gambled, fought, and played aggressive games of economic warfare. Rockefeller's intensity came from a different, almost quieter place. A place shaped by years of watching his father vanish and reappear like a storm. A place shaped by his mother's belief that a person must ground themselves in faith, restraint, and structure. Rockefeller didn't want to get rich fast. He wanted to become unshakable. And this desire for stability shaped every decision he made in his early adulthood. Before oil, before refineries, before consolidation, Rockefeller mastered something far more important: the psychology of cost. One of the most revealing chapters in Titan is when Chernow writes that young John would agonize over a single penny, not in a stingy way, but in an analytical way. He had an extraordinary internal barometer for waste. If one penny was lost today, and another penny tomorrow, and another the next day, then the foundation of one's life was slowly crumbling. Rockefeller believed that destiny wasn't shaped by big events. Destiny was shaped by consistent, microscopic decisions most people ignored. That mindset became his superpower. When he entered the oil industry in the 1860s, a chaotic, speculative field full of risk-takers, dreamers, wildcatters, and outright gamblers. Rockefeller looked around and saw something no one else cared about. Everyone else obsessed over striking oil. Rockefeller obsessed over what happened after the oil was found. He studied refining, transportation costs, kerosene quality, freight fees, barrel leakage, inventory losses, and the sheer inefficiencies of the supply chain. He realized that the future wasn't in discovery, it was in discipline. At that time, refineries wasted enormous amounts of money. Kerosene wasn't standardized. Quality fluctuated wildly. Explosions and fires were common. Transportation costs ate half of a company's profits, and the entire industry behaved like a gold rush, not like a business. Rockefeller saw a landscape full of disorder, and every instinct he had since childhood started to work like a compass pointing toward opportunity. If the world was chaos, then the man who mastered order would eventually rule it. So he treated his first refinery not as a place to process oil, but as a place to test his worldview. He scrutinized every step of production. He cut costs with the precision of a surgeon. He reused byproducts other companies threw away. He extracted value from residues that competitors didn't even notice. And the more disciplined he became, the more profitable the refinery grew, until it was outperforming competitors at a scale that seemed almost unnatural, but it wasn't supernatural. It was the result of pure calculation. Rockefeller wasn't a gambler. He wasn't a speculator. He was a relentless optimizer whose emotional stability allowed him to operate while others panicked. When prices fell, he stayed calm. When competitors triumphed, he observed. When the market shifted, he adjusted silently. His advantage wasn't speed, charisma, or brute force. It was consistency. The ability to do the same thing, the right thing, every single day without fatigue. And this discipline was about to collide with ambition in a way that would change the history of capitalism. When Rockefeller partnered with Henry Flagler and later expanded Standard Oil, he wasn't simply building a business. He was constructing a machine, one driven by precision, ritual, and an almost monastic calmness that unnerved his competitors. Chernow describes him moving through the refinery floors with a notebook always in his hand, quietly calculating losses, discovering and speaking in the same soft voice whether profits were soaring or fires were raging. He seemed immune to panic, and this wasn't a personality quirk. It was a cultivated tool. Rockefeller believed that the greatest financial mistakes came from emotional volatility. He knew that an impulsive decision could destroy the compounding effect of a decade's worth of discipline. So he practiced emotional neutrality the same way a monk practices silence. While other oilmen shouted, threatened, gambled, and celebrated loudly, Rockefeller observed them like a scientist watching test subjects. The more excited they became, the more predictable they became, and the calmer he remained, the more control he had over the situation. This control became the foundation of Standard Oil's strategy. Rockefeller understood that most competitors were not defeated by external forces. They were defeated by their own instability, financial, emotional, or managerial. Prices would fluctuate, and rivals would slash production in fear. Rail rates would shift, and smaller refiners would scramble. Rumors of shortages or floods would send companies into a frenzy, but Rockefeller would remain still, waiting, watching, ready to move only when the mathematics were irrefutable. This is where his penny philosophy matured into something far more powerful. A penny saved wasn't just a penny earned. A penny saved was a competitive weapon. If Standard Oil could refine kerosene even a fraction cheaper than competitors in every stage of production, those fractions compounded into margins that could outlast any storm. Rockefeller didn't need to bankrupt his rivals. He just needed to survive longer than them, and his discipline made survival easy. A striking example appears in the famous railroad negotiations. While other refiners fought among themselves for better shipping rates, Rockefeller approached the railroads with a different mindset entirely. He offered them something revolutionary: stability, guaranteed long-term shipments, predictable volumes, consistency, and in exchange, he demanded lower rates and rebates that competitors could never match. This wasn't aggression. It was mathematical inevitability. The refiner who mastered discipline would always extract better terms than the refiner who negotiated from desperation. As Standard Oil grew, Rockefeller's discipline evolved into something even more impressive, a kind of compound intelligence. He didn't innovate with technology the way Edison did. Instead, he innovated with systems. Waste became profit. Byproducts became new industries. Order became dominance. He took low-value residues like Vaseline, lubricants, paraffin, petroleum jelly, naphtha, and turned them into revenue streams that transformed a messy, inconsistent industry into an empire of vertical integration. And through it all, he never raised his voice. He never lost control. He never let ego disturb analysis. His greatest power wasn't money. It was the capacity to think clearly when everyone else clouded their minds with emotion. This was the psychological engine behind Standard Oil's rise, the invisible structure that turned pennies into power. But Rockefeller's dynasty wasn't built by discipline alone. It grew from a deeper and far more unusual trait, one that surprised even his harshest critics. One of the great misunderstandings about Rockefeller is that people assume he built a dynasty purely through ruthless business tactics. But to read his correspondence, his journals, and the recollections of those who worked closest to him is to discover something far more complex. Behind the machinery of discipline was a man who relied on something almost contradictory: serenity. Rockefeller protected his calmness the way an emperor protects a throne. He treated inner peace as infrastructure, as essential to empire building as refineries, rail contracts, or pipelines. He practiced it daily when competitors accused him of destroying small refiners. When journalists launched investigative crusades, when Congress threatened him with inquiries, Rockefeller responded with the same ritual: long walks, quiet reflection, prayer, and a deliberate return to emotional neutrality. He believed a disturbed mind made poor decisions, and poor decisions destroyed dynasties. So he built a life designed to keep him unshakably centered. This inner stability radiated into his business. Employees noticed that Rockefeller never rushed. He didn't slam doors. He didn't interrupt. He didn't bark orders. His calmness was so absolute that one associate said being in his presence felt like standing next to a bank vault. It wasn't coldness. It was total self. And that level of control created a culture around him, a culture where precision was expected, panic was forbidden, and haste was considered a moral failing. This was perhaps most evident during economic crises. While other industrialists collapsed into fear, Rockefeller treated downturns as opportunities. When the panic of 1873 wrecked banks and bankrupted refiners across the country, Rockefeller expanded. He bought distressed assets at low costs, not out of greed, but out of long-term logic. He knew that the men who had spent years acting impulsively would not survive, but the man who had spent years mastering patience would. Chernow writes that Rockefeller viewed the business world like a river full of currents that dragged impulsive men under while allowing the steady and disciplined to glide through. He didn't sprint ahead of competitors. He let them exhaust themselves. They would overbear over speculacci, overplay their hands. Then, at the moment when their foundations cracked, Rockefeller would step forward quietly, offering terms they couldn't refuse. It looked like domination, but from his perspective, it was simply gravity, the natural result of discipline meeting disorder. This emotional detachment also shaped his decision. When Standard Oil began consolidating the industry, Rockefeller insisted on fair compensation for every refiner they acquired. He wanted no unnecessary enemies and no impression of cruelty. He genuinely believed he was rescuing the industry from chaos. And in many ways, he was right. Before Standard Oil, the oil market was a chaos of fluctuating prices, dangerous products, unpredictable supply chains, and countless fires. After Standard Oil, kerosene became safer, cheaper, and more reliable than ever. But it wasn't the consolidation that built the dynasty, it was the mindset behind it. Rockefeller was playing a game of decades, not years, and his ability to see that far ahead came from a psychological composition unlike anything the business world had seen. The turning point in Rockefeller's life, the moment he transitioned from simply accumulating wealth to engineering a dynasty, came when he realized that money itself was not the end game. Money was only the material. The real architecture was built from something deeper: continuity. Rockefeller didn't want a fortune that lived and died with him. He wanted a structure that would outlast markets, panics, government investigations, even the eventual breakup of Standard Oil. He wanted a system that would survive him. This shift began subtly. As his wealth grew, Rockefeller became more obsessed with controlling not just costs, but outcomes. He studied the volatility of markets and understood early what few businessmen ever grasp. Unstructured wealth disappears. Fortunes built on speculation evaporate. Fortunes built on personality collapse when the personality is gone, but fortunes built on systems endure. So he began quietly building those systems. It started within Standard Oil. He turned the company into a kind of industrial organism horizontally integrated to eliminate duplication, vertically integrated to capture every ounce of value, financially integrated with a management style that resembled a disciplined military unit more than a corporation. His executives operated like lieutenants. Decisions flowed through structure, not chaos. And every improvement in efficiency, every incremental reduction in cost, every standard applied to production, transportation, or distribution increased the lifespan of the entire enterprise. But Rockefeller soon realized something profound. Even the strongest corporation cannot outrun the mortality of its founder. If he wanted his empire to remain intact, he needed a strategy that reached beyond Standard Oil's lifespan. This is where the dynasty mindset fully formed. He began transferring his surplus wealth into trusts, a revolutionary concept at the time. Trusts allowed him to consolidate ownership, minimize fragmentation, protect assets from market volatility, and create a mechanism through which future generations could steward the empire without dismantling it. Rockefeller understood something most wealthy men never do. Wealth divided is wealth destroyed. So he created structures specifically designed to maintain unity. At the same time, he became increasingly deliberate about how he raised his children. He didn't want heirs who floated on inherited privilege. He wanted heirs who understood discipline. His children received allowances. They learned bookkeeping. They reported expenses to him with the same rigor that Standard Oil executives used to report refinery output. He made them understand that wealth was not entitlement. Wealth was responsibility. As he built these personal systems, Rockefeller also made a decision that shocked many at the time. He began giving his money away, but he didn't do it impulsively or emotionally. He approached philanthropy with the same precision he applied to business. He didn't scatter his fortune. He built institutions, universities, medical research centers, foundations, each one designed to compound social progress the way Standard Oil compounded efficiency. Every gift was an investment. Every donation was a calculation. Every act of generosity was a structure meant to keep building long after he was gone. Rockefeller wasn't constructing monuments. He was constructing machinery of industry, machinery of philanthropy, machinery of legacy. He didn't want a legacy that depended on memory. He wanted one that depended on systems. And in that pursuit, pennies turned into power, not because of their quantity, but because of the mind that directed them. By the final decades of his life, Rockefeller had already become a mythic figure, both feared and admired, criticized and studied. But as he aged, something remarkable happened. The world finally began to understand the philosophy behind his empire. What looked like domination was actually design. What looked like ruthless efficiency was, at its core, a worldview built on discipline, restraint, faith, and the belief that order could turn even the smallest resources into unstoppable momentum. Rockefeller didn't see wealth the way ordinary men did. To him, money was simply crystallized discipline. Every dollar represented years of controlled decisions, careful habits, patient thinking, and emotional steadiness. And that's why he protected it so meticulously. He didn't hoard money out of fear. He managed it out of respect. He believed wealth had a purpose, not to decorate one's life, but to strengthen one's foundation. This foundation became most visible in the way he handled adversity. After the 1911 Supreme Court decision that broke Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, many assumed Rockefeller's power would finally fade. But the opposite happened. Because he had structured everything with discipline, the breakup exploded his wealth instead of destroying it. He had created an organism so efficient that cutting it apart only revealed how strong each part had become. Within a few years, his net worth had multiplied, not because he fought the change, but because he had built something resilient enough to survive it. This resilience wasn't financial alone. Rockefeller's personal habits also revealed a mind trained for longevity. He kept meticulous routines. He avoided unnecessary conflict. He refused to waste emotional energy on distractions. He walked daily. He prayed daily. He protected his peace as if it were capital, and in many ways, it was. His calmness became his greatest asset, the one trait no competitor could copy. You can replicate a refinery, you can copy a business model, but you cannot duplicate a mind that has spent decades removing chaos from itself. This philosophy extended into his philanthropy, which is arguably the most lasting part of his dynasty. Rockefeller didn't give to gain praise. He gave to solve problems at scale. His funding of medical research helped eradicate diseases. His support of universities created generations of scientists, doctors, and thinkers. His foundations shaped public health, education, conservation, and social reform, and he structured his giving with the same precision he used to structure Standard Oil: methodical, calculated, long-term, deeply strategic. He believed that money should create perpetual motion, and in many ways, it has. More than a century after Rockefeller built his empire, the institutions he funded still function. The companies born from the Standard Oil breakup still dominate global markets. The family trusts he established still manage vast resources with the same disciplined philosophy he cultivated as a boy tracking pennies in a ledger. That is the real legacy. Not the fortune, not the monopoly, not the controversies. The legacy is the system. The dynasty was antemagi avoyo. It was made of structure, built slowly, patiently, deliberately, one disciplined decision at a time. And that is how Rockefeller turned pennies into power. Not through aggression, not through luck, but through an internal architecture so strong that even time itself could not erode it.